Yes, Madam.
Good evening. For the period September 1st, 1939 to the middle of August 1945, do you have a guesstimate of the death toll worldwide?
Yes. I mean, the generally accepted figure is somewhere between 60 and 70 million. Chinese historians, though, say that the figure of 20 million Chinese dead, which is included in that 60 to 70, is totally inadequate. Some of them are even putting it up to 40 or 60 million. Now, one has to be very careful about those sort of figures. I mean, at one stage, the Russians, the generally accepted figure now of Russian deaths in the Second World War is 26 million, of whom 9 million military and 17 million civilian. But at one stage, Russian historians tried to increase the figure by doing it on the basis of projected population if there had not been those deaths. Well, I mean, that's starting to be statistically very dubious. And that may be what the Chinese historians are sort of playing at as well. I think it's almost certainly over 20 million in the case of China, but whether it's 40 or 60, I'm much more dubious. But anyway, the overall figure is probably over 70, or it's around 70, or it might be over 70.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening. The 1944 plot, von Stauffenberg and Valkyrie and Tom Cruise and all that, which we're familiar with.
My wife hates the idea of me ever going to a movie with me. She knows I'm going to start grinding my teeth. And when I saw Cruise as Stauffenberg doing a salute like that, I thought, oh no, please.
But well publicized as that is, that obviously took place when the shadows were getting longer for the Third Reich.
Yes.
And people were looking for survival and welcome in the West. In your research, have you found any evidence of a credible movement within the German military to overthrow Hitler back in the glory days?
Well, there was certainly, in 1938. The trouble was, again, it was a tiny minority. And one of them, of course, was General Franz Halder, who was later the chief of staff of the army. But Halder, all of them were very, very nervous. And I think it goes back very much to Bismarck's brilliant remark of 50 years earlier, 60 years earlier, when he said that when a German puts on uniform, he loses all moral courage. That doesn't mean they lose physical courage, but they lose moral courage, and that is absolutely true. And what is very striking was the lack of moral courage. Once they felt that they'd sort of sworn an oath of allegiance, and frankly they'd been forced to swear an oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler, many of them backed out or felt dubious about it. And the generals showed the greatest moral cowardice of all. I mean, those who had sort of supported the resistance, Manstein up to a certain point, but definitely Kluge, and then sort of suddenly backed off, certainly in 1944 when it came to the plot. And that's why Stauffenberg and some of the others, they felt it was time for the middle rank, the colonels, to step in because they couldn't really trust the generals at that particular stage. But one has to remember also that, Stauffenberg and the others were never really going to achieve very much. I mean, their view of, if you like, a post-Nazi Germany was more akin to Wilhelmine Germany of the sort of First World War. They still believed that they should hang on to the Ukraine and various occupied areas and Czechoslovakia and so forth. And it was unbelievably naive to believe that the Allies might even accept that or find it a basis for negotiation. And many people have criticized Roosevelt and Churchill for the statement at Casablanca on unconditional surrender. I think that Churchill felt that we should do it, but we should keep it quiet. I don't think that made a huge amount of difference, as some historians have claimed, particularly the revisionist historians. Where the Americans, I think, were unbelievably stupid was to have broadcast the Morgenthau Plan, because that played straight into Goebbels' hands.
It was to turn into a rural country, basically.
Yes, exactly. Yes, the idea that sort of Germany should be turned, all industry should be stripped from it and should be turned into a pastoral society. hard to imagine in a way, but anyway. The real question, though, of the 44 plot was that the British certainly had already assessed. They had planned Operation Foxley, which was to assassinate Hitler, but then it was cancelled because, as the if you like, the contingency planners and certainly those involved in SHAFE, even before D-Day worked out, Hitler actually was an asset to the Allies because he was such an appalling military commander. And in fact, they didn't really want Hitler to be got rid of because it would only prolong the war. Now, whether that's, whether they're absolutely right in that particular way or whether it would have led to a complete collapse is, again, I'm afraid, speculative and counterfactual history. And I'm afraid to say it's crucifix and the garlic whenever I hear counterfactual history because I don't want to have anything to do with it. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you, sir.
Yes,
Mr. Beevor, you have suggested that once Hitler became Chancellor, that war was pretty well unavoidable.
Yes.
But my question is, if he had been conveniently killed in World War I, would the German defeat in World War I, the Versailles Treaty, and the Depression have been enough to bring Germany to war again?
Well, no, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, the trouble is that I'm sure that there would have been some sort of conflict of some form, but it certainly wouldn't have taken the form that the Second World War took as a war of annihilation. Yes, there was certainly anti-Semitism in Germany. Yes, there was a hatred of the Slav and a fear of the Slav, which went back quite a long way. But it didn't take the same manic, hysterical form that the Nazis adopted. I mean, there might, as I say, there might well have been conflict. There was certainly an instability in Europe as a result of the Versailles Agreement. One of the problems, which actually, of course, is slightly relevant today, is that most of the countries of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire had constitutions imposed on them, which included proportional representation, which meant basically the formation of coalition governments. Now, coalition governments can be absolutely fine in ordinary times and times of peace, but in moments of crises, and crisis or whatever, and conflict, a coalition government is very vulnerable indeed. Thank God Holland is a very stable society, but I mean, one sees the way that Geert Wilders, having just pulled out of the coalition there, Holland is without a government until September. Now, as I say, no trouble so much with Holland. But with some of the other countries, when coalitions fail to come together, or you have, like in Greece, you have sort of an election which is inconclusive, then things are rather dangerous. No, I think there would have been some sort of conflict, but I don't think it would have been anything like as devastating as the Second World War. Thanks very much.
Yeah, okay.
I think we better not have any more questions after those who are present standing up there. So,
you mentioned the redeployment of troops from the Japanese front, where the Russians redeployed troops to the German front.
yeah.
What was the impact of the redeployment of German troops to support Mussolini's invasion of Greece on that war?
Well, this is, again, has been quite a long debate on that particular one. I think it was finally solved at a conference, or more or less resolved at a conference in Salonika, and I can't remember how many years ago it was. There has always been the theory that Hitler's invasion of the Balkans and of Yugoslavia and Greece delayed the whole of Operation Barbarossa. And I think most historians now are agreed that it was not that invasion, or that was not so much the strike down, or wasn't even the invasion of Crete. The real delay, in fact, there were two reasons which delayed Operation Barbarossa in that sort of critical moment from May to June 1941, was due to the abnormally heavy rainfall in Central Europe. All of the airfields which had been earmarked for the Luftwaffe were completely waterlogged. And it was waiting for those fields to dry out, which was one aspect. The other one was the redeployment of French army vehicles. One of the reasons why Stalin so loathed the French and despised the French was because their surrender in 1940 had handed the Germans almost 3 times as many motor transport vehicles as the German army had possessed. The French was actually the French army in 1940 was one of the most motorized armies in the world. It's something one tends to overlook because they were so old-fashioned in other ways. And in the invasion of the Soviet Union, in some of the divisions, 80% of their transport was French. But that was one of the things, one of the delays, contributory factors to the delay of Operation Barbarossa in 41.
All right, you asked for one-part questions, but and this is a little flippant, but if it wasn't...
Sorry, I can't, can you speak
You
into
asked
the
for
microphone?
only one question, but if it wasn't for the rainy season, would that diversion have made a difference?
Well, again, I'm afraid here we're into pure speculation. I mean, there was the Bulgarian ambassador who was approached by Stalin after the invasion, sort of saying, you know, would he arrange some sort of negotiations? And this was in October. And he convinced Stalin, you know, even if you withdraw all the way to the Urals, you'll still win in the end. And that was the whole question. Even if they'd lost Moscow, I think that the Russians, the Red Army, would probably have prevailed in the end. It was just too vast a landmass, and Hitler had totally failed to absorb the lessons of the Sino-Japanese War. That, you know, even an inferior army, if it's able to withdraw into a landmass, will eventually beat or wear down a far more effective and better armed army, especially if it's in smaller numbers and a minority.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, madam.
My question relates to research as a war historian researcher. Because at my father's funeral, an old fellow in Canadian military regalia came to me and said, I know you don't know this, but I want you to know your father was on the Enigma project that cracked the code and ended the war. Well, I didn't even know my father was in the war. So I've, you know, tried then to research the Enigma project, and of course all I come up with is that machine. So I wonder about technique. I mean, how do you get in at it?
Well,
get at it?
There are large numbers of books on Bletchley Park. I don't know any of them which give a full list of all the people involved. I mean, because there were probably, you know, there were several thousand people involved at Bletchley, all in different departments. Whether the whole ultra operation of Bletchley and interception changed the war or shortened the war, as some historians sort of have claimed in the past, I think is difficult to assess. It certainly saved us from disaster on a number of occasions. That's absolutely true. But you can never come up with a thing that it shortened the war or was a sort of a war-winning thing on its own. But it was certainly an extraordinary contribution and did make a huge difference. But I think that, you know, you could start with, from a research point of view, you could start with Google, you know, with Bletchley and all the rest of it, but also find some of the more detailed names. You can then also get onto the National Archives, and this is the British National Archives website, and you can do a search. And you can do a search on your father's name, and if he appears in any of the records, and that is the fantastic thing about that search machine, that search engine, what used to be the PRO, but is now called the National Archives, or TNA, which seems a rather strange thing. You can pick it up. So, I mean, that wouldn't be a bad way to start. And you can just do that literally from sitting at home with your own computer, before even having to travel to Britain or even to spend time in queue working through documents. So it could save a lot of time.
I have gone there, and all I come up with is that machine, and nowhere is my father's name mentioned. And also in the Toronto Library, there's Signals Corps books, the Secret Signals Corps, et cetera, and.
But surely you can get hold of his army record, can't you?
We should, we have 3 more questions.
Yeah.
So.
Maybe I can.
Thanks. Why couldn't Hitler get fascist Spain in the war on his side?
Interesting question. Yes, Hitler was had mixed feelings about getting Franco's Spain in on the war, partly because Franco was demanding so much. When they met at Hendaye in October 1940, Franco made such demands on Hitler, saying, I'm prepared to enter the war. That would have been a great help to Hitler from a strategic point of view, because if Franco had come into the war, they would have been able to knock out Gibraltar or capture Gibraltar, and then they'd have been able to seal off the Mediterranean, which would have been a huge blow to Britain. There's no doubt about it. But Franco was demanding so much, he was saying, I need to have this, that, and the other, and produce such a shopping list, that Hitler afterwards complained that Franco made him feel like a Jew, which coming from Hitler, was quite an extraordinary thing. He later sort of came up with a whole list of other things of why he disliked Franco so much. He said he'd rather have his teeth drilled than have another time, because Franco basically refused to stop talking. And Hitler was not used to having other people lecturing him, and he could hardly get a word in edgeways. He was also rather irritated because I'm afraid the Spanish railways were in such a bad state that Franco arrived about 2 or 3 hours late, and so Hitler was left to kick his heels on the station platform at Hendaye, which again didn't exactly improve his mood. But the point was, Franco wanted to play a sort of double game in a way that he owed Hitler huge amounts because the Spanish nationalists had received so much in the way of weapons from Germany and so much support in the form of the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War that they owed large amounts of money. And this is actually one of the reasons why the Spaniards starved so much during the war, because they were having to pay back the Germans in kind with all the pigs and the cattle and food that they could produce themselves, and that's why so many Spaniards were just literally fainting in the street from starvation and malnutrition. So in fact, the Spanish army wouldn't have been necessarily that strong, very old-fashioned weapons and all the rest of it. But Hitler would in some ways have liked Spain in the war, but certainly not on the terms that Franco demanded. Sorry, a brief question, brief answer. It could have been longer. Thank you very much.
Why do you think the Japanese are re-examining or have come to, or trying to come to terms now, and how widespread and genuine is their re-examination of the Japanese?
Oh, not widespread at all. I'm afraid to say this is only amongst, I think, younger historians. I've been thrilled to hear that sort of, Japanese society as a whole was prepared to re-examine what happened in the past. But Japanese society, as we know, is incredibly conservative. Ancestor worship is a major aspect, and the idea of actually criticizing the leaders is sort of almost beyond the pale for conventional Japanese society. Obviously amongst the young, certainly the rebellious young, and thank God also amongst some of the younger historians and academics, that attitude has started to change, and that's where I think where hope lies. But you certainly won't get it amongst middle-aged or elderly Japanese at all, I'm afraid.
It's an amazing read. Antony Beevor, thanks very much indeed. Lovely talking to you.